Before we start coding HTML, let's talk about what it is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a markup language for describing web pages. It's not a full programming language, but rather a way to mark up the content of a site so that a web browser knows how to display it. For instance, we can mark up our page's title or heading with HTML to get the browser to display it in larger, bolder font. Let's see how this works. If you're following along with me in your favorite editor, just make sure that you can create and edit an HTML page and that you can preview it in a browser. If you're using Dreamweaver, just know that the design or live view are previews of what it would look like in the browser, so it's fine to use that in place of actually viewing it in the browser. Now, when we're looking at Dreamweaver and it starts a new HTML page, it adds a bunch of markup language in there for us. And this is definitely what we need for every page, but for right now it kind of muddies the waters. So let's go ahead and delete it so we can see what a browser does when you don't use markup language. So if I start some content on my page, in the code side, I can just type about us and then click inside of the design view or preview it in the browser and see how it shows up. And the good thing is it actually does show up. The problem is I don't think it's as prominent as it should be for my page title. So I think the page title should stand out from everything else. I think it should be bold, bigger, and it should be more prominent on the page. Unfortunately, because the browser doesn't actually know that this is a page title, it's just going to display it in the generic 12-point Times New Roman font. Let's see what else it does when it doesn't have markup language. So I've already kind of typed up some information, and don't worry about reading all of this, but it's just going to make it easier and faster for us if I just paste it. And it should not have done that. All right, let's go ahead and paste that. All right, so now when we look in the browser side of it, we've got a problem. We have one major page heading here. We have a subheading of our history here. And then we have 4 separate paragraphs that make it easier for people to read because it breaks it up from a huge paragraph into 4 easier to manage or easier to read paragraphs. So we have a problem here because the browser doesn't know the difference between a heading or a paragraph or a subheading. It's just going to take all of your content and display it generically with that 12-point Times New Roman font and all together in one continuous paragraph. So that's what markup language is going to do for us. It's going to allow us to tell the browser what each chunk of information is so that it knows how to properly display it. Now, in a future video, we'll talk more about the structure of HTML and understanding what an element is and tags and things like that, but let's just preview quickly what markup language does. So markup language is usually tags that will start at the beginning and end of some content that tell it essentially what this kind of content is. So this is my page heading, and it's the major heading on the page. So this is where I'm going to use some markup language called heading 1. So that's my heading 1 tag. And it's open with an opening and closing angle bracket. And it's at the start of my content because basically we're telling the browser, this is the start of a heading 1. Here's the actual text for the heading. And then we need to close that heading 1 tag by doing open angle bracket /H1 and then a closing angle bracket. So it's exactly the same tag. It's just that it has a / because we're telling it that this is the end of the heading 1. If we didn't have that closing tag, well, let me just show you what this looks like and then I'll show you what happens if you didn't have it. So now when I click in here to the browser side, it's going to show me that the heading is more prominent now. It's bolder, it's bigger, and it's on its own line and it has a gap between it and the rest of the content. So by telling the browser this was a heading 1, it knows how to display it properly. If I were to get rid of this closing tag, and I'll just cut it for now, see how nothing is displayed? One of 2 things can happen. Either it's not going to properly display the about us, or, and let's see if it'll happen in the browser. See how everything on here looks like a heading 1 now and it's huge and it's bold? That's because once we open that heading 1, it's going to assume that everything should look like that heading 1. So that's why we need to close that tag. So this heading is not as important as the main page heading. So we're going to do a tag called heading 2. Again, we're going to open it and we're going to repeat it, but just with the / so that it knows that we're closing that heading 2. And notice it's still bold and big, but it's not as big as the heading 1. And we can go all the way up to heading 6, which is super, super small, but we'll show you that. So anyway, we're marking up all of this content so that the browser knows how to display it properly. So when it comes to paragraphs, notice that we have 4 different paragraphs, but in here, it looks like 1 paragraph. Well, the reason why is because we need to mark up each of these paragraphs so it knows to separate them. So the paragraph tag is just a basic p tag. And if we come in here, now you'll see that this one is now separate from this one. Now, you're going to be tempted because now they do look like 2 paragraphs to just not mark up this paragraph. But just to make sure that our web page displays correctly in all browsers and that we meet all the rules that are required, we need to make sure that we wrap it around every single paragraph. So for all of these, the markup is going to be around each chunk of content. And the very last one, and let's see how it looks. So there we go. That shows us each of the chunks. It displays in a certain way. And if we were to preview this in the actual browser, the browser now knows how to interpret what each of these chunks are and make them look a certain way so that it's easier for us to read and understand.